We live in an era that is seeking knowledge constantly. But God has a better plan than that. He wants to give you wisdom. So today on Daily Renewal, we're going to discuss how to access the wisdom of the King. Hello everybody, this is Pastor Lyle and welcome to Daily Renewal. We're going to continue our series today on Jesus is King. If you're new to the channel, I just want to encourage you to subscribe to our channel so you can get new videos. We try to do these Monday to Friday. And the reason we do it Monday to Friday is so that people have the opportunity, if they're hungry for God, to have something every day. So we do our best to do a Monday to Friday program. And it also helps us if you press the like button to get the videos distributed to more people. So in the idea of that we're talking about today, in Jesus being King, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of wisdom. Now, there is a big difference between knowledge and wisdom. In the book of Daniel, chapter 12, he prophesied about the last days, and in verse 4 he says this, But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Now this is talking about the last days, and I really do believe that we are in the last days. And in looking at this scripture in conjunction to where we are at today, it's very easy to see, even with the invention of the internet, just how much knowledge we have. I've got a friend of mine who I was sitting in a coffee shop with today, and we were talking about another friend of ours, and I said, you know, this friend of ours, it's amazing how he's become a coffee connoisseur. He's got it down to a science, how to do all different ways of brewing coffee. He knows about roasting. And he said to me, he says, how does he know so much about coffee? And I said to him, I asked him, and he'll tell you the way he learned it from YouTube. It's amazing today how we can just, at the couple clicks of buttons, we can get knowledge about pretty near anything. Not all of it's good knowledge, but we can find out how to do stuff just with our phone in our hand. Well, you couldn't do that when I was a kid, but now knowledge has increased. So the idea of knowledge, as beneficial as it is, as I mentioned, it's important that we understand that there is a huge difference between knowledge. As was prophesied, knowledge will increase, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that is God's best. God's best is that we operate, yes, in knowledge, but with that knowledge, we also have understanding. And you know, I remember when I was a kid in grade 4, I had a teacher that was determined to teach me my timetables. And I remember she would ask me, you know, every day we do the timetables, and it would come to me, and she asked me, and I remember this specifically, she says, what's 6 times 7? And I said, I don't know. And she says, the next day, I'm going to ask you tomorrow. And I'd come back and I'd forget because I was out playing and doing stuff. Next day I came and she said, what's 6 times 7? And I said, I don't know. And then the third day, same thing, 6 times 7, I didn't know. And she looked at me, she says, if you don't know 6 times 7 tomorrow, you're getting a detention. And I'll tell you, I went home and I learned 6 times 7. The next day I came to school and she looked at me and she said, 6 times 7. And I said, 42. And then she looked at me and she said, 7 times 6. And I went blank. And she gave me a detention. I knew what 6 times 7 was, but I did not understand that 7 times 6 was the same thing. Having a knowledge of something and yet understanding how it works is totally different. And let me tell you, well, since that day, I will always remember what 6 times 7 and 7 times 6 is because I've got an understanding of it more now. It's not just a memorization. You know, I know that I really believe that in this era, there's a lot of people who do know that there's a God and may even know that Jesus Christ lived and made some kind of a mental decision about Jesus. but they don't truly understand. They don't truly look to him as king in such a way where they count on him to give them wisdom, not just knowledge, but help them understand what they know to be true. And it's God's desire for us to have wisdom. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that today. So today I want to start off by talking about a story of a king in the Old Testament that understood the importance of wisdom, and that was Solomon. You know, Solomon had just taken over from his father, and he really felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of being a king. And on one night, the Lord visited him. It said God appeared to him, and you find this story in a couple places, but we're going to look at 2 Chronicles chapter 1, and in verse 7, it says that on that night, God appeared to Solomon and said to him, "Ask, what shall I give you?" And then Solomon began to think about what should he ask God for. And in verse 10, he says this. It says, "Now give me wisdom and knowledge, that I may go out and come in before this people. For who can judge this great people of yours?" Then God said to Solomon, "Because this was in your heart, and you have not asked for riches or wealth or honor or the life of your enemies, nor have you asked for long life, but have asked for wisdom and knowledge for yourself, that you may judge my people over whom I have made you king. Wisdom and knowledge are granted to you, and I will give you riches and wealth and honor, such as none of the kings have had who were before you, nor shall any after you have the like." So God was so pleased that Solomon understood what he was asked to do. He was a king, and rather than ask for something that would really benefit him, and wisdom does benefit him, he was looking at the idea that if I don't have wisdom, I don't have anything. I need the wisdom of God, and God granted it to him. And it was really interesting what happened, because this story is also mentioned in 1 Kings. And in that other portion where it talks about this, it follows up by talking about one of the judgments that Solomon had to do as king that proved to the nation that he was a wise king. And this is a great story. I want to share this with you today. It starts in verse 16 of chapter 3 of 1 Kings. And here's the story. "Now 2 women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him." And then as we read this story, and I encourage you to read this on your own, what happened is that both of these women had children, and one of the children ended up dying, and now both women were claiming to be the mother of this child. So they came to the king to settle the dispute. And so the king does something so unorthodox, and we pick up the story in verse 24. The women had come to plead their case, and then he says, "Bring me a sword." And so they brought a sword before the king, and the king said, "Divide the living child in 2 and give half to one and half to the other." And then the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, for she yearned with compassion for her son. And she said, "O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him." But the other said, "Let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him." And so the king answered and said, "Give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is the mother." And all of Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice. Now, the first thing that I want to submit to you from this story is when we look at this, it seems like such an outrageous story. And I've found at times, for me as a church leader, there is times where God has given me wisdom, knowledge and wisdom about situations that I never would have thought on my own. And even I remember as a new believer, there's times where I ask God, help me understand this, Lord. And it was amazing how he would make his wisdom available to me in situations where I would have done it totally different. And yet this is one of the ways that God proves himself for us to ask for wisdom because he gives it to us. And we're going to talk about that more in just a moment. But the other thing that I want to establish that is vital, a key principle that we see through the Old Testament that applies to the New, is in the Old Testament they had kings. And like this situation, these women knew that in order to get a proper judgment, they would have to go to the king. They understood that there was wisdom, and especially now after this first test of the new king, God would give the king wisdom. They believed that by coming to the king, that he is going to have the wisdom of God and that this will be dealt with properly. Well, how does that apply to us today? Do we have a king in the natural? We may have, presidents or prime ministers or some kind of leader, and there is countries with kings, but even those countries, they probably don't serve the same way that they did in the Old Testament. So how does this apply to us? Well, for us that are believers, we know that Jesus is King. And he shows us that we are to bring our issues, our trials, our problems, our questions to our King the same way that they would bring their questions to the kings in the Old Testament. Well, Jesus is our King. So from there, I want to show you a real key principle that is going to help us with some of the things that we go through today. Now, when we keep in mind that Jesus, yes, he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. In other words, there isn't a king in history that had more wisdom than Jesus, the King of Kings. If Old Testament kings had wisdom, well, Jesus has the fullness of that. He is our King. And so when we look at the book of James, I think it's really important to understand, how do we approach our King when it comes to wisdom? Well, in James 1, it talks, starting in verse 5, it says this: if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. This is vital, first of all, to understand that Jesus, just being somebody that you believe might be related to God, isn't going to be good enough. We have to embrace the fact that Jesus is not just King, but he's my King. And if he's my King and I approach him like one of those that understand that he's our King, then we understand that as we approach him, he is going to give us all the benefits of his kingship. And one of those benefits is that he will give us wisdom. And it says here that he will give us wisdom liberally. In other words, he's wanting to give us wisdom. Not only does he have all wisdom, but it's his desire to give it to us. He doesn't want to hold back wisdom from us. This is the King who has seen the beginning, the middle, and the end of everything in existence. He's the author and finisher of your faith. He knows everything about you. He knows about the things you're going to do even before we do them. So he knows what we need and how to get it to us. And so when we come to him, he wants to give us wisdom. He wants to, yes, give us knowledge, but he wants to bring understanding to us. And so, number one, we have to understand that he wants to give it to us liberally. But secondly, he says, without reproach. Well, what does that mean? If you look at some of the other translations, and I'll translate that a little bit differently from some of the other translations, this idea of without reproach can be translated, he wants to give it all without finding fault. Another translation puts it this way: he won't rebuke you for asking, or he won't rebuke you. In other words, if you find that you're in a place where you're a washout with God, well, you know what? That's the time when you need to ask for wisdom. That's the time where you need understanding. That's the time when you need to turn to the King. And he says that if you're going to ask for wisdom, especially if you need it, he wants to give it to you, and he's not going to look at you and say, well, you know, you didn't go to church this weekend, so I don't think I want to give you wisdom. No, a good king wants everybody in the kingdom to be functional. And that's why it says that he gives to wisdom liberally. He doesn't want to hold back for his wisdom from you. As long as you approach him and you sincerely are saying, God, I want to know what you want me to do, and the desire of your heart is to say, if you show me, I will do it. Not only does he want to give it to you, but he doesn't want you to think he's not going to give it to you because you aren't in the right place with him. By him giving wisdom to you liberally, this could be something that, again, will help you see just how much he loves you, just how much he cares, and just how much you can trust him as king. But as we see here, the key to the whole thing, the key to getting wisdom is making sure when you ask the Lord for wisdom that you ask in faith. Do you believe that God wants to give you wisdom today? Because he does. Do you believe that he's not trying to look at you and say, well, when you're good enough, maybe I'll give you wisdom? No. He wants to give you wisdom now. And if you believe that, you trust in that, then you sit and you wait and you listen. What is God trying to show you? Because he will get you the answers to the things you need. But you have to trust that he is going to give you those answers. Will you trust him today? If you choose not to trust him, he says that anybody who doesn't trust that God wants to give you wisdom is a double-minded man, and he's unstable in all his ways. So the challenge today, ask God for wisdom. Trust him that he'll bring it, and as a result, God will give you the answers that you need, and then from there, you just follow. Well, I hope you got something out of that today. If you did, again, I want to remind you to consider subscribing to our channel. Press the like button that helps us distribute the videos to more people. Feel free to leave a comment. And also, you can like us on Facebook, and we're on Twitter and Instagram as well. And if you're in the Kamloops area, I just want to encourage you, come by River City Church. We'd love to have you. Having said that, God bless you, and have a great day.